God-given prophecy is history in advance. Church history is his story of Jesus building his church in the world from his place seated at the right hand of the Father in providence. The History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley is perhaps one of the most complete chronicles of that history. Thank you for joining me. We will continue right where we left off last time. Chapter 27. The Academy of Geneva. Foundation of the Academy. Subscriptions. Its opening. Its literary equipment. Its subsequent renown. Its library. What it suggests. Calvin's simplicity of life. Sadoleto visits him. The Cardinal's surprise. Calvin's poverty. His charity. He declines the aid of the council. In the wake of the gospel, Calvin held that the learning and the arts should always be found. Geneva had become, in the first place, a fountain of divine knowledge to the surrounding countries. He would make it, in the second place, a fountain of science and civilization. In Italy, letters came first, but in England, in Bohemia, in Germany, and now in Geneva, the divine science opened the way, and letters and philosophy followed. It was drawing towards the evening of his life when Calvin laid the foundations of the Academy of Geneva. Next to the Reformation, this school was the greatest boon that he conferred on the Republic, which had only lately enrolled his name among its citizens. It continued long after he was dead to send forth distinguished scholars in every department of science and to shed a glory on the little state in which it was planted, but where, previous to the Reformation, scarcely one distinguished man was to be found. The mind of Calvin, and he wished not to die until he had realized it. Having communicated his design to the council, it was approved by their excellencies, and in 1552 a piece of ground was purchased on which to erect the necessary buildings. But money was lacking. Geneva was then a state of but 15,000 to 20,000 inhabitants. Its burdens were numerous. It had to exercise hospitality to from 1,000 to 2,000 refugees. It had to endure the expense of war in a time of peace, owing to the continual rumors set on foot that the city was about to be assaulted. After satisfying these indispensable demands, the citizens had not much money to spare. For 6 years the ground in which the future college was to stand lay untouched. Not a sod was turned, not a stone was laid. Impatient at its delay, and thinking that he waited long enough on the council, Calvin now set on foot a public subscription, and soon he found himself in possession of 10,000 florins. This was little for the object, but much for the times. He immediately laid the foundations of the edifice. He marked with joy the rising walls. Tearing himself from his studies, he would descend from the Rue de Chaumont to the scene of operations, and, though enfeebled by Courtenay, he might be seen dragging himself over the works, speaking kindly words now and again to the workmen, and stimulating them by expressing his satisfaction at their progress. 2 edifices were rising at the same moment under the eye of the reformer: the organization of the French Protestant Church and the building of the Academy went on together. The organization of the French Protestant Church and the building of the Academy went on together. On the 5th of June, 1559, just 11 days after the meeting of the National Synod in Paris, the college was ready to conceive both masters and pupils. The inauguration was celebrated by a solemn service in St. Peter's, at which the senators, the ministers, and the burgesses attended. After prayer by Calvin and a Latin address by Beza, the laws and statutes of the college, the confession to be subscribed by the students, and the oath to be taken by the rector and masters were read aloud. Theodore Beza was appointed rector. 5 masterships. Calvin had asked 7, 1 of Hebrew, 1 of Greek, 1 of philosophy, and 2 of theology, were instituted. In 1565, a year after the death of the Reformer, there was added a lectureship in law, with her academy, which, however, was but the top stone of a subsidiary system of instruction which was to prepare for the higher. Geneva was fitter than ever for the great spiritual and moral sovereignty which Calvin intended that she should exercise in Europe. Bungener's description of this memorial is as touching as his reflections are just. After the venerable cathedral, says he, no building is dearer to the Genevese. If you go upstairs to the classrooms, you are in the rooms of the library, full of memorials, yet more living and particular. There you will be shown the books of Calvin's library, the mute witnesses of his vigils, his sufferings, and his death. There you will turn over the leaves of his manuscripts, deciphering with difficulty the few lines of his feverish writing, rapid as his thoughts, and, if your imagination will but lend itself to the breathing appeals of solitude and silence, there he himself is. You will behold him gliding among those ancient walls, pale but with sparkling eye, feeble and sickly, but strong in that inner energy, the source of which was in his faith. There also will appear to you round him all those of whom he was to be the father, divines, jurists, philosophers, scholars, statesmen, and men of war, all filled with that mighty life which he was to bequeath the Reformation, after having received it from her. And if you ask the secret of his power, one of the stones of the college will tell you it in a few Hebrew words, which the Reformer had engraved upon it. Come into the court, enter beneath that old portico which supports the great staircase, and you will read, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And it is neither on the wall, nor on one of the pillars that these words are engraved. Mark well, it is on the keystone. What an emblem, and what a lesson! The position which Calvin now filled was one of greater influence than perhaps any one man had exercised in the Church of Christ since the days of the Apostle. He was the counselor of kings. He was the adviser of princes and statesmen. He corresponded with warriors, scholars, and reformers. He consoled martyrs. He organized churches. His admonitions were submitted to, and his letters treasured, as marks of no ordinary distinction. All the while, the man who wielded this unexampled influence was in life and manners in no wise different from an ordinary citizen of Geneva. He was as humbly lodged, he was as simply clothed, he was served by as few attendants as any burgess of them all. He had been poor all his days, and he continued to be so to the end. One day a cardinal of the Roman Church, Sadoleto, who happened to be passing through Geneva, would pay him the honor of a visit. He was conducted to number 122 Rue de Chaumont, and told to his surprise that this was the house of the Reformer. A yet greater surprise awaited the cardinal. He knocked for entrance. There was no porter at the gate. No servant in the livery gave him admission. It was Calvin himself that opened the door. His enemies, more just to him then than they have been since, acknowledged and admired his indifference to money. That which made the strength of that heretic, said Pius IV, when told of his death, was that money was nothing to him. The pontiff was correct in this fact, but at fault in his philosophy. Calvin's strength was rooted in a far higher principle, and his indifference to riches was but one of the fruits of that principle. But how natural the reflection on the part of one who lived in a city where all men were venal and all things vendible. The Reformer's wants were few. During the last 7 years of his life, he took only one meal a day, sometimes in the 36 hours. His charities were great. The Protestant exiles were ever welcome to his table. Kings sometimes were borrowers from him, and a small stipend left him often in pecuniary difficulties. But he never asked the council for an increase of his emoluments. Nay, he positively refused such when offered. Satisfied with my humble condition was the witness which he bore to himself, in the place where he lived, and before the eyes of all. A little while before his death, I have ever delighted in a life of poverty, and am a burden to no one. I remain contented with the office with which the Lord has given me. The registers of the Council of Geneva bear to this day the proofs of his disinterestedness and forgetfulness of self. In January 1546, the Council is informed of the sickness of Mr. Calvin, who hath no resources. The Council votes him 10 crowns, but Mr. Calvin sends them back. The councillors buy with the 10 crowns a cask of good wine and convey it to Calvin's house. Not to give offence, the reformer accepts their lordship's gift, but lays out 10 crowns of his salary for the relief of the poorest ministers. In the winter of 1556, the council sent him some firewood. Calvin appeared with the price, but could not induce the council to accept it. The registers of 1560 inform us of another cask of wine sent to Mr. Calvin, seeing that he has none good. The reformer this time accepts, and yet, because he received those few presents in the course of a ministry of 26 years, there have not been wanting men who accused him of coveting such gifts, and of parading his ailments, of which indeed he seldom or never spoke, in order to evoke these benefactions. If there are any, said he, in his preface to the Psalms, whom in my lifetime I cannot persuade that I am not rich and moneyed, my death will show it at last. In his last illness he refused his quarter's salary, saying that he had not earned it. After his death it was found that his whole possession did not exceed in value $225, and if his illness had been prolonged, he would have had to sell his books or receive the money of the Republic. On the 25th of April, about a month before his death, the reformer made his will. Luther's will was highly characteristic. Calvin's is not less so. It exhibits the methodical and business habits that marked his whole life, mingled with the humble, holy hope that filled his heart. Having disposed of the 225 crowns, and of some other small matters pertaining to the world he was leaving, he thus breaks out, I thank God that he has not only had mercy on this poor creature, having delivered me from the abyss of idolatry, but that he has brought me into the clear light of the gospel, and made me a partaker of the doctrine of salvation, of which I was altogether unworthy, yea, that his mercy and goodness have borne so tenderly with my numerous sins and offenses, for which I deserve to be cast from him and destroyed. Chapter 28. The Social and Family Life of Geneva. The Daily Sermon. Its Attractiveness. Daily Life of the Citizen. His Dress. His Table. Development of Wealth. The Refugees. The benefits they conferred on their adopted country. English names on the Genevan registers. The Sabbath in Geneva. Now that Calvin has realized his program, let us look at the social and family life of the Genevese. The Christian idea, as Gabriel calls it, had created their state, and religion was the all-pervading and dominant element in it. Calvin, the people, the state, all three were one. The fusion was complete, and the policy of the Senate and the action of the citizens were but the results of that great principle which had called into existence this marvelous community. The sermon held a first place among their institutions. Day by day it reinvigorated that spirit which was the breath of Geneva. But besides the needs the Genevans felt of the instructions and consolations of religion, there were other influences that acted in drawing them to the temples. Preaching was then a novelty. Like break of day in an eastern clime, the gospel, in midday effulgence, had all at once burst on these men after the darkness of the Middle Ages. Scarce had the first faint silvery streaks shown themselves when lo, the full flood of the sun's light was poured upon them. The same generation which had listened to the monks had now the privilege of listening to the reformers. From tales, legends, and miracles which were associated in their minds with the yoke of foreign masters, they passed to the pure and elevating doctrine of the Word of God, which, apart from its own beauty and majesty, were, they knew, the source whence had come their political and civil independence. We at this day can but faintly realize the charm that must have then hung around the pulpit, and which assembled day after day the Genoese in crowds to the preaching of the gospel. At Geneva, the magistrate, as well as the artisan, invariably began the day with an act of worship. At 6 in the morning, the churches were opened. The crowds might be seen in every quarter of the city on their way to spend an hour in listening to the exposition. After this, the youth assembled in school or college, and the father and the elder sons repaired to the workshops. The midday repast, which was taken in common with the domestics, again reunited the family. After dinner, the head of the household paid a short visit to his club to hear the news. And what were the events on which the Genevan kept his eyes intently fixed, and for what he waited from day to day with no ordinary anxiety to receive tidings? The great drama in progress around him completely occupied his thoughts. How goes the battle, he would ask, between Protestantism and Rome in France, in Italy, in Spain? Has any fresh edict of persecution issued these days from the Vatican? Has anyone been called to yield up his life on the scaffold? And what were his last words? What number of refugees have arrived in our city since yesterday, and through what perils and sufferings have they managed to reach our gates? Such were the topics that furnished matter of daily talk to the Genevese. The narrow limits of their little state were far from forming their horizon. Their thoughts and sympathies were as extensive as Christendom. There was not a prisoner, not a martyr for the gospel in any of its countries for whom they did not feel and pray. He was their brother. Not a reverse befell the cause of the reform in any part of the field which they did not mourn, or a success in which they did not rejoice. They were watching a battle which would bring triumph or overthrow, not to Geneva only, but to the gospel. Hence the gravity and greatness of their character. The Genevan of that day, says Gabarel, took the same interest in the news of the kingdom of God which he takes today in the discussion of material affairs. The family life of Geneva at that period was characterized by severe simplicity. Their dress was wholly without ornament. The magistrates wore cloth. The ordinary burgesses contented themselves with serge. This difference in their attire was not held as marking any distinction of class among the citizens, for the members of the councils were chosen entirely with reference to their merit, and in no wise from any consideration of birth or wealth. Nor did this avoidance of superfluities lead in any falling off in the industrial activity or the inventive skill of the citizens. On the contrary, the arts and industries flourished, and both the citizens of Geneva and the refugees who found asylum within it became famous for their manufacture of objects of utility and luxury, which they exported to other countries. If their dress was marked by plainness, not less were their tables by frugality. The rich and poor alike were obliged to obey the sumptuary laws. The heads of families, says Gabarel, seeing the ease, the health, the good order, the morality that now reigned in their dwellings, blessed those rigorous laws, which only gluttons found tyrannical, who remembered with regret the full tables of other days. We dare say some of these men would have wished rather that their dinners had been ampler, though their liberty had been less. They are not first who have thought the blessing of freedom too dearly purchased if bought with the sacrifice of dainties. When periods of distress came round, occasioned by war or famine, the citizens were especially sensible of the benefit of this simple and frugal manner of life. They felt less the privations they had then to bear, and were able to support with dignity the misfortune of the state. Moreover, as the result of this economy, the wealth of the citizens was rapidly developed, and the state reached a prosperity it had never known in former days. Each citizen laid by religiously a certain portion of his earnings, and the years of the greatest calamity were precisely those that were signalized by the greatest beneficence. Instead of receiving support from other states, Geneva sent its charities to the countries around, becoming a storehouse of earthly as of heavenly bread to the nations. These citizens who wore plain blouses and sat down to a meal correspondingly plain, entertained during many years with liberal Christian hospitality the refugees of religion, nobles, scholars, statesmen, and men of birth. The Genevan citizen, independent of means, and adding thereto that mental independence which the gospel gives, could not but be a being of conscious dignity and of character inherently grand, whom no call of devotion or heroism would find unprepared. Geneva profited immensely in another way by the movement, of which it had become the headquarters. The men who crowded to it, and to whom it so hospitably opened its gates, conferred on it greater advantages than any they received from it. They were of every rank, profession, and trade, and they brought to the city of their adoption not refinement of birth and elegance of letters only, but also new arts and improved industries. There immediately ensued a great quickening of the energies of labor and skill in Geneva, and these brought in their turn that wealth and conscious dignity which labor and skill never fail to impart. It is a new nation that we behold forming on the soil of the Republic, with germs and elements in its bosom, higher and more various than infant state had ever before enjoyed. The fathers of the great Roman people were but a band of outlaws and adventurers. How different the men we now see assembling on the shores of the Leman to lay the foundations of the Rome of Protestantism, from those who had gathered at the foot of the Capitoline to lay the first stone in the eternal city. From the strand of Naples to the distant shores of Scotland, we behold Protestantism weeding out of the surrounding countries and assembling at this great focus all who were skillful in art, as well as illustrious in virtue, and they communicated to Geneva a refinement of manners and an artistic skill which it continues to retain after the lapse of 3 centuries. The most important question raised by the arrival of these exiles was not, where shall bread be found for them? The hospitality of the Genevans solved this difficulty, for scarce was there a citizen who had not one or more of these strangers living under his roof and sitting at his table. The question which the Genevese had most at heart was, how shall we utilize this great access of intellectual, moral, and industrial power? How shall we draw forth the varied capabilities of these men in the way of strengthening, enriching, and glorifying the state? Let us begin, said they, by enrolling them as citizens. But, said the libertines, when the proposal was first mooted, Is it fair that newcomers should lay down the law to the children of the land? These men were not born on the soil of the Republic. True, it was answered, but then the Republic was not an affair of acres. It is an affair of faith. The true Geneva is Protestantism, and these men were born into the state in the same hour in which they became Protestants. This broad view of the question prevailed. Nevertheless, the honor was sparingly distributed. Up until 1555, only 80 had received the freedom of that city. In the early part of that year, another 60 were added. A small number truly when we think how numerous the Protestant exiles were, the greatest of all the sons of Geneva. He who is more than a citizen, who was the founder of the state, was not legally enrolled until 5 years before his death. The name of John Knox was earlier inscribed on the registers than that of John Calvin. Hardly was there a country in Europe which did not help to swell this truly Catholic roll. The list contributed by Italy alone was a long and brilliant one. Luca sent, among other distinguished names, the Calandrini, the Berlamacci, the Turretini, and the Micheli. Of these families many took root in Geneva, and by the services which they rendered the state, and the splendor their genius shed upon it in later days, they repaid 100-fold as citizens the welcome they had received as refugees. Others returned to their native land when persecution had abated. When the English returned, says Misson, they left in the register, which is still preserved, a list of their names and qualities. Stanley, Spencer, Musgrave, Pelham are among the first in it, as they ought to be. The title of citizen, which several had obtained, was continued to them by an order and complement of the seniority, so that several earls and peers of England may as well boast of being citizens of Geneva as Paul did of being a citizen of Rome. One of the most striking characteristics of the Geneva of that day, and for a century after, especially to one coming from a popish country, was its Sabbath. The day brought a complete cessation of labor to all classes. The field was unwatered by the sweat of the husbandman. The air was unvexed by the hammer of the artisan, and the lake was unplowed by the keel of the fisherman. The great bell of St. Peter's had sounded out its summons. The citizens have assembled in the churches. The city gates have been closed, and no one is allowed to enter or depart while the citizens are occupied in offering their worship. Everywhere the stillness of the sacred day is sublime, but here that sublimity was enhanced by the grandeur of the region. The Sabbath seemed to shed its own pure and peaceful splendor upon the sublimities of nature, and these sublimities, in their turn, seemed to impart an additional sanctity and majesty to the Sabbath. There was a peace on the blue waveless Leman. There was peace on those plains that enclosed it in their vast sweep, and on whose bosom the chalet lay hid amid festooned vines and tall pine trees. There was a peace on the green rampart of the Jura, and peace on the distant Alps, which in the opposite quarter of the horizon lift their snowy piles into the sky and stand silent and solemn as worshippers. A superb temple indeed seems the region, walled in by natural grandeurs, and pervaded throughout with a sabbatic peace. In the midst of it is the little city of Geneva. No stirs or tumults are heard within it. Its bells and its psalms only salute its bells and its psalms only salute the ear. Beaming faces, the sign of happy hearts, tell what a day of gladness it is, the most gladsome of all the seven. In every dwelling is heard the melody of health. But we must go to St. Peter's would we see, in its highest manifestation the power of the Sabbath to raise the souls and mold the character of the people. A crowd of magnanimous, earnest, intelligent faces look up around the pulpit. These are gathered the finest intellects and holiest spirits of all Christendom, for whatever was noble and pure in other countries had been chaste there. The worship of men like these could be no common affair, no mere show or pantomime, like that performed in bespangled vestments amid lighted tapers. The worshippers in St. Peter's were men whose souls had been tempered in the fire, and who, having forsaken all worldly goods for the sake of the gospel, stood prepared every hour to sacrifice life itself. Their worship was the worship of the heart, and their prayer the prayer of faith that pierces the heavens. As the devotion of the hearers was entire, so the instruction of the pulpit were lofty. The preacher might not always be eloquent, but he was never tame. He forgot himself and remembered only his great theme. Did he discourse on some point of doctrine? His exposition was clear, his words weighty. If he plead the cause of the confessors of other lands, led as sheep to the slaughter, it was with a truthfulness and pathos that made his hearers mingle their tears with his, and prepared them to open their doors to such of the persecuted as might escape the prisons and stakes which their enemies had prepared for them. Such were the scenes that might be witnessed every Sabbath in those days within the walls of St. Peter's. If Geneva was the interbureau of the European Reformation, as Gabarel says, the pulpit was the inner spring of power in that bureau. While the pulpit of Geneva stood, Geneva would stand. If the pulpit should fail, Geneva too would fall. It was the bulwark of its liberties, the horses and chariots that guarded the independence of the state. It was at the fire which burned continually on this altar that the men of Geneva kindled the torch of liberty, and their love of liberty daily recruited that indomitable firmness which so perplexed and mortified Philip II in the Escurial, and the Pope in the Vatican, and many others besides, who never warred against the little state, save to be broken upon it. Chapter 29. Calvin's Last Illness and Death. Calvin's painful maladies. Redoubles his labors. Last appearance in the pulpit. Europe watches his deathbed. The plague breaks out. Its frightful ravages. Calvin's last participation in the Lord's Supper. Goes for the last time to the Senate. He receives the senators. Receives the pastors. Farel visits him. Sits down at table for the last time with his brethren. His last week. One continued prayer. His death. His burial. His grave. To the reformer, the close was now near. His body, never robust, suffered numerous maladies that made life a prolonged torture. The quartan ague of 1559 he had never recovered from. He was afflicted with pains in his head and pains in his limbs. Food was often nauseous to him. He suffered from asthma and spitting of blood. He had to sustain the attacks of the gout and the yet more excruciating agony of the stone. Amid the ruins of his body, his spirit was fresh and clear and vigorous as ever. But as the traveler quickens his steps when the evening begins to fall, and the shadows to lengthen, Calvin redoubled his efforts. If so, before breathing his last, he might make that legacy of wisdom and truth he was to leave to the Church still more complete and perfect. His friends in many lands wrote imploring him to take a little rest. Calvin saw rest, everlasting rest, coming with the deepening shadows, and continued to work on. Beza tells us that during his last malady he translated from Latin into French his harmony on Moses, revised the translation of Genesis, wrote upon the book of Joshua, and finally revised and corrected the greater part of his annotation on the New Testament. He was all the while receiving and answering letters from the churches, and had just before made the final touches to his immortal work, the Institutes. The last time he appeared in the pulpit was the 6th of February, 1564. On that occasion, he was seized with so violent a fit of coughing that it brought the blood into his mouth and stopped his utterance. As he descended the stairs, amid the breathless stillness of his flock, all understood but too well that his last words in the pulpit of St. Peter's had been spoken. There followed weeks of intense suffering. To the martyr, when mounting the scaffold, the Reformer had said, "Be strong and play the man." During 4 months of suffering, not less severe than that of the scaffold, was Calvin to display the heroism which he had preached to others. The more violent attacks of his malady were indicated only by the greater pallor of his face, the quivering of his lips, the tremendous motion of his clasped hands, and the half-suppressed cries, "O Lord, how long?" It was during these months of suffering that he prosecuted the labors of which Beza, who was daily by his bedside, tells us in the passage referred to above. A little cold water was often his only nourishment. For days, having refreshed himself therewith, he would again resume work. On his deathbed were riveted the eyes of all Christendom. Rome awaited the issue of sickness with intense excitement, in the hope that it would rid her of a great foe. The churches of the Reformation asked with sorrowful and most affectionate anxiety if their father was to be taken from their head. Meanwhile, as though to impress the minds of men and make a great mourning around this mighty bier, the plague broke in and inflicted unprecedented ravages on almost all the countries of Europe. It traversed Germany, France, and Switzerland, and men fell before it, says Rouquet, as fall the leaves in autumn when the tempest sweeps through the forest. This pestilence was equally fatal on the mountain top and in the low valley. In the Toggenburg and other parts of Switzerland it entered hamlets and villages, where it left behind it not one living man. In Basel it struck down 7,000 persons, among whom were 13 councillors, 8 ministers, and 5 professors. Among the latter was the learned Cellarius. At Bern from 1 to 2,000 died. It visited Zurich, and numbered among its victims Theodore Bibliander, the successor of Zwingli. Bullinger was attacked, but recovered, though he had to mourn the loss of his wife and 2 daughters. At Herisau, in the canton of Appenzell, there were upwards of 3,000 deaths. The Protestant congregations, in some cases, assembled in the open air, and when they celebrated the Lord's Supper, the communicants, in order to avoid infection, brought each his own cup and made use of it at the table. It was in the midst of the universal gloom created by these terrible events that men waited from day to day for tidings from the sickbed at Geneva. Calvin longed to appear yet once again in that church where he had so often preached the gospel. On the 2nd of April, says Beza, it being Easter Day, he was carried to church in a chair. He remained during the whole sermon and received the sacrament from my hand. He even joined, though with trembling voice, the congregation in the last hymn, "Lord, let thy servant depart in peace." He was carried out, Beza adds, his face lighted up with a Christian joy. 6 days before, the 27th of March, he had caused himself to be borne to the door of the council chamber. Ascending the stairs, supported by 2 attendants, he entered the hall, and proposed to the Senate a new rector for the school. Then, taking off his skull-cap, he thanked their excellencies for the kindness which he had experienced at their hands, especially the friendship they had shown him during his last illness. "For I feel," he said, "that this is the last time that I shall stand here." The tones of that voice, now scarcely audible, must have recalled to those who listened to it for the last time the many occasions on which it had been lifted up in this same place, sometimes to approve, sometimes to condemn, but always to attest that he who spoke was the fearless champion of what he believed to be the truth, and the unbending and incorruptible patriot. His adieu moved the council to tears. A month later he sent another message to the council, intimating his desire to meet its members once more before he should die. Having regard to his great weakness, the council resolved to visit him at his own house. Accordingly, on the 30th of April, the 25 lords of Geneva, in all the pomp of a public ceremony, proceeded to his humble dwelling in the Rue de Chanon. Raising himself on his bed, he exhorted them, amongst other things, to maintain ever inviolate the independence of a city which God had destined to high ends. But he reminded them that it was the gospel which alone made Geneva worth preserving, and that therefore it behooved them to guard its purity if they would preserve for their city the protection of a stronger arm than their own. Commending them and Geneva to God, and begging them one and all, says Beza, to pardon him his faults, he held out his hand to them, which they grasped for the last time, and retired as from the deathbed of a father. On the morrow he received the pastors. Most affectionate and touching was his address. He exhorted them to diligence in their office as preachers, to show fidelity to the flock, to cultivate affection for one another, and above all, maintain the reformation and discipline which he had established in the church. He reminded them of the conflict he had to wage in this matter, and the afflictions that had befallen him, and how at length God had been pleased to crown his labors with success. His many maladies and sicknesses, he said, had at times made him morose and hard to please, and even irascible. For these failings he asked pardon, first of God, and then of his brethren, and finally, Beza adds, he gave his hand to each one after the other, which was with such anguish and bitterness of heart in every one, that I cannot even recall it to mind without extreme sadness. The council he had bidden farewell. His brethren he had bidden farewell. But there was one friend, the oldest of all, save Cordier, who had not yet stood at his deathbed and received his last adieus. On the 2nd of May, Calvin received a letter from Farel, in which the writer intimated that he was just setting out to visit him. Farel was now nearly 80. Could he not wait the little while till he had put off his tabernacle? And then, with less difficulty to either, the two friends would meet? So it would seem did Calvin think, and hence the letter he immediately dictated. Farewell, my best and most faithful brother. Since it is God's will that you should survive me, live in the constant recollection of our union, which, in so far as it was useful to the Church of God, will still bear for us abiding fruit in heaven. I wish you not to fatigue yourself on my account. My breath is weak, and I continually expect it to leave me. It is enough for me that I live and die in Christ, who is gain to his people, both in life and death. Once more farewell to thee, and to all the brethren, thy colleagues. A few days afterwards the reformer saw the old man, covered all over with dust, having walked from Neuchatel on foot. Enter his sick chamber. History has not recorded the words that passed between the two. He had a long interview with him, says Rouquet, and on the morrow took the departure for Neuchatel. It was a long way for one of 80 years, and yet surely it was meet that the man who had met Calvin at the gate of Geneva when he first entered it nearly 30 years before should stand beside him when about to depart. This time Farel may not stop him. Yet a few days more was the Reformer to pass on earth. The 19th of May, or the Friday before Whit Sunday, brought round the censures, as they were called. The pastors on that day met and admonished each other fraternally, and afterwards partook together of a modest meal. Calvin requested that the dinner should be prepared at his house, and when the hour came, he had carried himself into the room where the repast was to be eaten. Seated amongst his colleagues, he said, "I am come to see you, my brethren, for the last time, for save this once, I shall never sit again at table." He then offered prayer, but not without difficulty, and he ate a little, endeavoring, says Beza, to enliven us, but, he continues, before the end of the meal, he requested to be carried back to his chamber, which was close by, saying these words with as cheerful a face as he could: "A partition between us will not prevent me, though absent in body, being present with you in spirit." He had spoken truly. From the bed to which he had been carried, he was to rise no more. There remained yet 8 days to the Reformer on earth. These were almost one uninterrupted prayer. The fervency of his supplications was indicated not so much by his voice, now scarcely audible, as by his eye, which, says Beza, retained its brightness to the last, and testified to the faith and hope with which he was animated. He had not yet left earth, and yet he had left it, for of earthly bread he ate not. With men he had ceased to converse. He halted here, at the portal of the invisible world, to calm, to elevate, and to strengthen his spirit, by converse with the eternal, before passing its awful but blessed threshold. It was now Saturday, the 27th of May. He seemed to suffer less, and to speak with greater ease. But at 8 o'clock of the evening, the sure signs of death became apparent. He was repeating the words of the apostle: "The sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory to be." Without being able to finish, he breathed his last. Beza, who had been summoned to his bedside, was just in time to see him expire. And thus, says he, on this day, with the setting sun, the brightest light in the Church of God on earth was taken back to heaven. The event was briefly chronicled in the consistorial register thus: "Went to God, Saturday, the 27th." Early on the day following, which was Sunday, the remains of the Reformer were wrapped in a shroud and enclosed in a wooden coffin preparatory to interment. At 2 o'clock the funeral took place. It differed in no respect from that of an ordinary citizen, save in the much greater concourse of mourners. The body was followed to the grave in Plain Peleus, about 500 paces outside the city, by the members of the Senate, the body of the clergy, the professors in the college, and by the citizens, and many distinguished strangers, not, says Beza, without many tears. Over the grave to which they had consigned so much, the pastor, the patriot, and the Reformer, they raised no monument. Not a line did they write on marble or brass to tell the ages to come who reposed in this grave, and what he had been to Christendom. They arranged in reverent silence the dust above him, and departed. In this they but fulfilled Calvin's own wishes. He had enjoined that he should be buried after the customary fashion, and that customary fashion, says Bungener, which was observed down almost to the present day, was that no monument should be raised upon any grave, however illustrious the deceased might be. He was buried, says Rouquet, with all simplicity, in the common cemetery, as he himself had desired, so simply that no one at this day knows where his grave is. For more than 2 centuries, says Bungener, that grave has been dug over and over again, like the rest, by the sexton's spade. And for less than 20 years a black stone has marked the spot where Calvin perhaps reposed, for it is only a tradition. But it is well, perhaps, that neither tomb nor monument was raised to Calvin. Forgetting his dust, we stand face to face with the living, thinking, deathless spirit, and rise to a truer and more sublime ideal of the man. Death has not caused Calvin to retire. He is still with us. He speaks to us in his works. He lives in the churches which he organized, and he prosecutes from century to century his vast plans in the continued progress of that moral and spiritual empire which his genius and faith founded, or, to speak more truly, restored. While that empire lives, Calvin will live. I wish to express a special thanks to all the supporters of First Amendment Radio and our mission on true prophecy reformation. If you'd like to support the work here with a special one-time gift, it would be greatly appreciated. We, however, always prefer an ongoing, faithful gift of support for the labor that continues here always. So please consider carefully how much you are able to continue without undue hardship to your own household. In the least, please like and share and subscribe wherever you are receiving this work. Thank you. Secrets of the Rapture. Is there a 500-year-old conspiracy? A propaganda machine so pervasive and entrenched, yet so elusive that the entire world could be taken in by it, working in plain sight, but unseen by the world for what it truly is? If prophecy is God-given history in advance, why does the prophecy that has conquered the age also exclude nearly 2,000 years of history? What is it that they are afraid that the light of history will reveal? To understand our place in time and prophecy, we must look in history for an interpretation, that which stands the test of time, that which agrees with the Word of God, and history has proven to be true. When cunning fables and fearful speculations are removed from our sight, then we may clearly see what is truly expressed in Bible prophecy, both that which has been fulfilled and that which has yet to come. God's express word is the sword that must be wielded to remove the scales from the eyes and dispel the darkness of deceitful conjecture. Secrets of the Rapture was written to expose that which the spirit of the age has conjured out of the darkness to blind the eyes of the church in the world today. Secrets of the Rapture, Deconstructing Pre-Tribulation Dispensational Futurism by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur, is now available at Amazon. Secrets of the Rapture,